Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Mark, for reaching out to me. Could everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. So it's great that I'm speaking right after Kayvon, who's talking about kind of the need to create these alternative medias for us to be more informed about what's actually happening in the Middle East and to sort of just have what's happening in the world outside of Kanye and Kim in our imaginations. I wrote up something on fiction as possibility and creating new maps. And before I start reading, I just want to say that this came from recent travels that I've had to Haiti, Cuba, and Bolivia in the past 2 years, where every time I ask, like, what do you think is the solution, or what kind of thing do you think that we need in order to really have change in the world that's positive, especially toward women and working class people, everyone says fiction. And as a fiction writer, I feel like, wow, fiction could possibly be the solution, the writing of fiction, the reading of fiction. So I'll just start with that. Okay, I'm honored to be here and share my story and thoughts with you today in regards to how we can build cultural bridges and strengthen our relationships as a global world. I would like to talk about 3 things today. How U.S. Latinos, I'm a Latina, I'm Dominican, I come from Dominican parents, but I was born in the United States. How U.S. Latinos are dismally underrepresented in mainstream media in the United States, and how the erasure of our stories can in some way be seen as a state of emergency that warrants our immediate attention. And especially if you live in cities like New York City and LA, I think that you will feel this more than any other place. My second thing that I would like to talk about is how reading fiction about culture outside the one we know or feel comfortable builds bridges across communities, and I believe creates new roadmaps to how we imagine the world we live in. And even though this seems so banal, yeah, reading creates roadmaps. Right now, fiction is under attack in the United States, and being that we're one of the largest cultural producers, exporters, that's a big problem because the way that the educational system and how our youth are being educated, they're basically no longer reading books. And that's a very scary thing. Like, they're reading a lot of nonfiction, and I think that's a very dangerous thing, because how will they imagine, our youth imagine, a different world or a different possibility? And they're all being written about the same kinds of stories, which is another thing. And the erasure of Latinos is a predominant theme in this. And my third point will be how governmental programs should make it a top priority to support writers and translators. Even though it doesn't seem like an urgent matter, I think long term it is an urgent matter. And I would also say, I see that there's like a really large, a large Asian presence here. Like, that's another marginalized community. But I will speak about the U.S. Latino community, being that I'm Dominican, and I'm more informed about that. So the U.S. is privileged to have one of the most ethically and culturally diverse populations. I read that on the website, and I said, yes, we are so privileged to have one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse populations. And according to our recent census numbers, there are more than 50 million Latinos in the United States today. A good majority of them are under the age of 30. In cities like Texas and California, New York, we make over 65% of people, right? That's a lot of people. That's like the majority of the demographic in the largest cities in the US. And yet, if you turn on the television or go see a film or enter a bookstore, you will not see one Latino protagonist on TV right now. That's not a side character, right? And even if they're side characters, their roles are really marginalized. This fact is so normalized that when I ask peers, even Latino peers, and skeptics to count the Latino fictional narratives in any given day they come across, they're shocked to see how non-existent they are, because we just accept it as that's the way things are. But once you start really looking, it's very, very shocking. In 2001, when I first wrote my novel, Soledad, I was part of what was called the mini boom. It was soon after Ricky Martin, I don't know if anyone remembers Ricky Martin, maybe you're all too young, took the world by storm and had us shaking our hips. Actually, I think there was a soccer thing going on at the time, with Living La Vida Loca. This was pre-9/11, And there was a window of opportunities where Latinos were getting published, films were getting made. There seemed to be a moment where there was going to be more visibility. Then 9/11 shook the market. I don't want to go into how and why. I mean, that's like a whole other conversation. But I just want to say that since my first book contract in 2001, and even though the Latino population has grown exponentially in the United States, in particular the Dominican population in New York City, where the publishing companies basically dominate the market, there has not been one other writer that has gotten a contract. That is crazy, I think. And that's over 10 years ago. That write in English. There have been some small presses that do publish Dominicans that write in Spanish. But as far as mainstream presses, there hasn't been. There's right now, currently, that you can find, there are 5 published writers from Dominican descent, and all published, have received their contracts before 2001. And I don't know what that means. Someone will have to go and study that. But it's a fact. And you will find hundreds of articles online about the lack of fictional narratives about Latinos in film and TV and books. But I am more concerned on the impact of this has on youth, now mostly, and youth in the United States, because in the end, these youth will start making decisions that impact the entire world, being that the U.S. has such a large influence on the world. I have firsthand witnessed how this lack of representation has had a tremendous effect on my own self-perception, and as a person who has traveled around the globe and country, have also seen the way that I am perceived by others because they don't know how to read me, right? The narratives that they have available to them through media are very different than what I represent to them, or what they see when they meet me. I cannot tell you how many times as an English professor at a university born in America have been complimented on my English. Even my students presume my incompetence and then are surprised by how I could be useful, right? If at first I can be angry or accuse them of being small-minded, I instead, my most generous self, realize that perhaps their prejudices can't be helped because their limited narratives of a Latino, I'm usually the first that they encounter in Pittsburgh, actually, in person, right? They literally don't know how to read me or to talk to me or to relate to me, right? And I don't blame this for that. I blame media, actually. Not having more narratives, the lack of existence, the erasure of Latinos in the mainstream media, affirm to others and also to young Latinos that their experiences are not entertaining, legitimate, or worthwhile to be told, and also not worth investing, right? Because someone's making investments on all of these projects that include film and books, etc. This is why myself and many Latinos who I know are now leaders in our respective fields consider our invisibility as a state of emergency. Because being that the U.S. is one of the largest cultural media exporters, as I said before, if not the largest, what we're saying to the world is that the Latinos that are in the U.S., born in the U.S., are not here or are not significant enough to weave into the U.S. narrative of what makes an American. And when we are represented, we are often, if not singularly represented, as a struggling victimized immigrant or hot and sexy and available for some kind of consumption. Pulitzer Prize-winning author Junot Diaz, who's gotten a ton of attention recently, he wrote, "We all know the importance of narratives, of stories. They are part of the reasons our brains are so damn big. We need stories. We thrive on them. Stories are how we shape our universe. Stories rule us. They find us. They bring us together. They bind us. And yes, they also pull us apart. Our erasure as Latinos perpetuates the segregation in our cities, the fear Americans have of the other, and builds barriers to important alliances that are necessary here, personally, and worldwide. Recently, children's book author Christopher Myers wrote a wonderful essay in the New York Times where he proposed reading books as a tool to be a better cartographer. The essay was in response to the fact that out of the 3,200 books published for children last year in the United States, 92 represented Black children, and the representation of Latino was around 50. It's especially a sad number when we know that the majority of youth in the US is Latino. And if they are Latino like me, who grew up straddled between the two countries, Dominican Republic and the United States, we are also very aware of international politics, right? But we're not represented in any of these books. Christopher Myers, says that out of all the kids he meets as a children's books writer, he finds that kids see books less as a mirror, but more as a map. They are indeed, and I find this too, they are indeed searching for their place in the world, but they are also deciding where they want to go. They create, through the stories they're given, an atlas of their world, of their relationships to others, of their possible destinations. This is important. Books offer more possibilities of where we want to go, which leads me into my second point, why it's so important that we have more fictional narratives that reflect the diverse and complicated world we live in, and also the possible worlds we want to live in. It is important that we read outside what makes us comfortable so we can see the possibilities. What makes fiction a real powerful tool is that it allows the writer to imagine another reality, a world that doesn't exist, or a potential that does exist, but we need roadmaps to get there. The reader can't escape this. Fiction sinks deep into the consciousness. It transforms us. This is why we must support it. For most of my education, I believed all writers were dead, white, and male. In fact, the only visible Latino as a child in the US was Oscar de la Renta. He's a fashion designer. I pursued fashion design like him, but was not happy. It wasn't until I met the legendary Bill Cosby. You must all know Bill Cosby. Yeah, okay. Some people don't know him anymore, but he was a big deal back then. This is not on TV, is it? Back then, he's still a big deal, all right, if you're listening. Okay. It wasn't until I met the legendary Bill Cosby while working at a cashmere store on Madison Avenue. In fact, back in 1993, I was one of the few women of color on Madison Avenue, and obviously I passed. When I got the job, they thought I was Italian. And then they found out I was Dominican, and they told me not to tell anyone. So that is another story. But okay, I got the job. I worked on Madison Avenue. And he noticed immediately that I was different. And one of the first things he asked me was, what do you want to do with your life? You obviously don't want to be here, right? Where do you want to go? If you can do anything, go anywhere, what do you want to do? This was Bill Cosby asking me. It was the first time I was asked that question. In my mind at the time, I had no option. The goal of any Dominican immigrant in the US I knew was to get a job, work hard, get an education, work hard. And stay out of trouble. Any which way you can. I was doing that. In many ways, I was already a success. It's not every day that Bill Cosby walks into a store and decides to mentor you. I was lucky. My friendship with him led me to get what he called a real education. After meeting him, I went to study English literature at SUNY Binghamton, and there I first read my first books by African American writers, Latino writers, Caribbean writers, Asian writers. And in those books, my consciousness was raised and my hunger to tell stories that have yet to be told, to fill in the gaps of narratives being told on television or in books where working class people, Latino people, were often side characters, ignited. I started to write so the people who raised me, the community I came from, would have more stories to lean on to use as a roadmap. So when they thought of their lives, they had more places they wanted to go. But what would have happened to me if I didn't have someone like Bill Cosby, which is like 1 in a million, walk into my life and propose a new roadmap by sharing his story? What or how? What or how would have America perceived African Americans or the world if Bill Cosby wouldn't have had The Cosby Show, which actually was the first TV show to reflect this particular reality of African Americans on television. And some argue that this is the reason why America, it was ready for a president like Obama as well. Being that I have witnessed firsthand how storytelling is one of the most powerful tools in social transformation, I will share with you a personal story. I was raised to believe that Dominican women had nothing in common with Puerto Ricans, African Americans, or Haitians. In fact, judging, fearing, and distrusting was common, and this is all from the Trujillo regime. I mean, basically they educated people to believe that they were better or different or had nothing in common. I grew up in a predominant Dominican community. We as a community were fairly new to New York City. We were suspect of others, and we kept mostly to ourselves. Then I went to study as an undergrad. This was 20 years ago, and it was there that I read Haitian-American author Edwidge Dandekat's book, Breath, Eyes, Memory, and the slave narrative, Incidents of a Life of a Slave Girl, and the book When I Was Puerto Rican by Esmeralda Santiago, to name a few. It was there in those books that I first saw a glimpse of something that resembled my life, my concerns as a woman of color in a book, as a working class woman. It was also then that I became conscious of the erasure of narratives that mirrored mine. U.S. Latino narratives were nowhere in the mainstream. It was through reading these books that I realized that we, as Caribbean women, Black women, working class women, disenfranchised women, although from different countries, shared a deep history. You might have heard the quote used by scholars of the Caribbean. Same trip, different ship. Has anyone ever heard that quote? It refers to the hundreds of slave ships that traveled to the New World. And yet, in our communities in the US, we're really segregated, right? Even though we share the same trip, different ship. That hunger for understanding and stories made me hyper aware and also made me very vocal at family reunions. My mother used to call me a nightmare because every time something was said that was problematic about Haitians or Puerto Ricans, I was the first to say they were wrong. At first, reading books created an intimate occasion for me to embrace and welcome difference into my heart and mind. But this new consciousness, and this is why education is so scary to so many people, created a trench between myself and my mother, right? And my family, but mostly my mother. She was the closest person to me at the time. I had decided she would never understand. She would never understand that she, as a victim of the media machine that sold these singular stories about people of color in the United States, she will never understand that she was wrong. Until one day, I left behind a pile of books at my mother's house. And without my knowing, she read them. I was very surprised. And suddenly my mother was calling out racism like I had months before, admitting that she had never known how similar a woman's reality in Haiti was to her own, as well as Puerto Rico. She confessed that when she read their stories, it was as if reading her own story. Books not only built a bridge between my mother and I, but a bridge that began to dismantle a lifelong miseducation produced in Dominican Republic by the Trujillo regime, right? And I feel like this microcosmic example also leads to the bridges that we need to build across in the world, right? Like, we can learn a lot from the ways that we get closer or come up to agreements in our own personal relationships. Being that myself, like my mother, was and continues to be sometimes implicated in imagining a single story for any given person that is new to me, I lean on books as a way to inspire compassion and intellectual curiosity in me and my students. Reading outside of my box is my way of expanding the map, the possible roads and possibilities. And in the same way, I try my best to share this process of possibility with my students and as a professor, and as a writer too, as I'm making media myself. Reading is our way of creating a new map. Fiction gives us the most elastic because it can probe the reality, help us reimagine new paradigms. And I say this because I think there's a big difference between nonfiction and fiction. There's a move toward found stories, heroic nonfiction stories, and exceptional stories, right? About people who survived 30 days in a mine or things that happen that are really important to share. But yet, these realities are often, the stories that are told in nonfiction are very exceptional. So the common person feels like unless they do something incredibly exceptional, they don't have reason to live, you know? Recently, I was in Haiti through the Iowa Writers Program. They have an international project that is funded by the U.S. Embassy. It's an excellent program that sends American writers abroad to connect and share resources with writers, and also leading cultural organizers. And when I was there, and I also visited Bolivia and Cuba, I asked cultural leaders again and again, and every time they said that their countries, above food, which was crazy, above infrastructure, they believe should spend their money on culture, even though it does not seem as the most urgent thing. And they are in urgent situations. And it was interesting, and there was an occasion where I met with 40 aspiring Haitian writers, all living in devastating conditions. And I did an exercise. And the writing exercise was that I asked them to write a character. And for 5 minutes, I had them write a character that came up to their mind and put them in a situation, and they wrote it. And then I said, I want you to take the age of your character, let's say it's 20, and write the character at 40, double their age, and write it in the future. And they wrote it, and they said that for them, that was one of the most important things that had happened to them in a long time, because they actually could not even imagine a future. But writing fiction helped them imagine a future for a character, and eventually also your life, right? So I will finish with this. For those of you in the US, I believe, even though it doesn't seem urgent, we must support the translation of fiction for people abroad, which is one thing that actually does not get a lot of support in the United States. Even though we produce so many books, we actually don't translate that many books by writers that are writing outside of the United States. But as people who are in the US, also to think about actually to read outside of their culture. And I would encourage to read fiction. Through reading, we have an opportunity to become intimate and find compassion with plights outside of our own, and to also find ways to align with other people. And I think that's all I'm going to say. Thank you so much. Well, I think storytelling, we can't live without it. We're constantly telling stories. When you go on a date, you're telling a story. When you're trying to get yourself out of a bad situation, you have to tell a story. When you're trying to get a job, you're telling a story. You're always writing a narrative about your life in that moment. And sometimes your character is the villain, and sometimes your character is the hero. You know, I am a mother now. I am often the villain, you know? And in order to really be successful, you have to tell a really good story. And I think that that's what we forget, that our fictions that are based on what we think is reality are fictions, right? And they're only one, it's like a dragonfly. It's only like one vortex of like way of seeing in that moment. And then it shifts, and then it shifts, right? You're here, you're telling me a story by yourselves, by the way you're dressed, by the way you're holding your body. You leave here, I don't know what you're going to do. And as great storytellers, and this is what I do, that's why I think fiction for me is also teaching about leadership. When I teach fiction, I say, I am teaching you how to become a leader in your own life. Because the first thing you ask when you're writing your own story is say, what does my character want? What are their obstacles? What is the possibility? What are all the different possibilities that character can take in this given story? And if you give that to yourself and you say, what do I want? Where do I want to go? What are all the possibilities? Why did I just close that door that's right here? Open it. What could that be? I think, yeah. And I think we do it, but I also think you could be trained to be better at it, right? And the better you are, the more compassion you will have. Because you will be in a class, I will be in a class, I will have you in my class, and I won't say, how strange, why are you here? Right? Like many of my students look at me and say, how strange, how did you end up here? Because they don't expect to see me walk in the class and teach them, right? They expect me somewhere else. It's not their fault. I think that there is a problem that we don't have enough narratives. And we need to become better at looking at narratives, and also reading out. People get comfortable. I do it too, you know, and but it's important. Yeah. So yes, very much alive.
We're running kind of behind schedule, but is there a final question, or should we conclude? All right, let's conclude.
Thank you so much.
Please express
Okay.
our sincere gratitude to Dr. Cruz.